We'd like to welcome everyone to the Tuesday night Bible study here at the Douglas Hills Church of Christ. We've been studying the subject of church history for this quarter, and we have the lesson tonight and one more, and then this series will be over. I tend to think of this class being for the Douglas Hills members. I realize it's online and available other places, but I don't really think that much about that. I think it's mostly our members, and it is, of course, mostly our members who are watching. But I got an email this morning from my good friend Dario Belvis in the Philippines. And he wrote me about other things, but in the course of that email, he mentioned that he has been watching it. So it may be realized that, that it could be a lot of people watching that are not in this area. And Dario is one of the hardest working preachers that I know anywhere, and one of the finest men I've ever met. And so I think the world of him and appreciate his taking his time to, such a busy man, to listen to this series. Tonight we're going to begin with the first Christian president. James A. Garfield was the 20th president of the United States, and he was elected president in 1880. Garfield was born in 1831 in a log cabin. His father died when he was 18 months old, and thus was raised by his mother. He was baptized in 1849 and preached his first sermon in 1853. He graduated from Williams College in 1856, taking the highest honors in his class. He became president of Hiram College in Ohio. Then he was commissioned a lieutenant colonel by Abraham Lincoln when the Civil War started. Many of the students in his regiment came from Hiram College. I mentioned that as we talked about colleges and about the Civil War earlier. He was known by his men as the praying colonel. So he took his religion with him and practiced it in the Army. He later became the youngest brigadier general in the Army. Then, in 1863, he left the service and was elected to the Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives. He had been a legislator in the Ohio legislature later in Ohio in 1860 before he received his commission. And then he served in the U.S. House of Representatives for 17 years. He was elected president in 1880, but was shot in the back by a vagabond rich French Canadian after just 3 months in office, and then died 2 months later. He's the only U.S. president ever to be a member of the Churches of Christ and also a gospel preacher. When he was in the legislature, he attended worship on a regular basis in Washington, and then when he was president, he was a regular attendee of the worship periods there in Washington while he served the short time that he was president. He is the only member of the church who was a preacher also and president. There are two others who are associated with Churches of Christ and the Christian churches who were president. Lyndon B. Johnson was the 36th president. While he was president, he attended the National City Christian Church there in Washington, D.C. He was a member of the First Christian Church in Johnson City, that was Texas, which was his home church, and his funeral was held in the National City Church in 1973. Another president that was associated with the Disciples of Christ was Ronald Reagan. Reagan was raised as a disciple in his native Illinois as a young man by his mother, who was a devout member of the Christian church. Of course, in later life, as far as we can determine, Reagan did not continue to participate in the Christian church that much, at least. At least it's not recorded that he did. So there's a whole chapter in the book about Garfield, and as I said, he was the only one who was a preacher and a member of the church. In fact, in 1860, before he went into service, he preached with Alexander Campbell They were in a joint service. They were in a church. He preached in the morning, and Campbell preached in the afternoon. So he was 29, and Campbell was 62 at that time. David Lipscomb, that we've talked about somewhat, and we'll talk about more, was not in favor of one involving themselves in the government. In fact, he refused to vote. But regarding Garfield, he said this: "We have been strengthened by this observation of his course," that is Garfield's, "in our conviction that no Christian can go in politics and maintain a Christian character. At the same time, that politics are not aided by the intrusion of religion into its domain. But we are satisfied that we know of no man who has gone into politics who has become so thoroughly identified with the affairs of government and yet so well retained his Christian character and religious interest as has General Garfield." So while he was not in favor of involving oneself in government, he thought of all those who had, Garfield was the best at doing that. We talked about liberal tendencies and men who held liberal views, and the church being going toward division because of the things that were practiced. So we want to talk a little more about that. In 1865, Moses E. Lord argued that division was virtually impossible. For in the first place, the teaching of the church virtually condemned it, and furthermore, the churches had no ecclesiastical tribunal to declare it. 3 years later, Benjamin Franklin voiced his approval of Lord's sentiments. Lord's point was the Bible teaches against division, and therefore we teach it, and therefore it's condemned. Since the churches of Christ were independent, autonomous, each individual congregation was not tied to any central organization, it was less likely that they would divide. But the passing years, another decade, in 1875, just 10 years later, many were less confident of the continual unity. One such preacher was W.B.F. Treat. He concluded that division was no longer out of the question. He preached for the church at Bloomington, Indiana, and saw the congregation divided over the introduction of the organ. He added, in some of his comments, there is a possibility of division over things not in the Bible, things that were added. The instrumental music, of course, being used in the church is not in the New Testament. It's not there. It's something that's been added by man, and division occurred over the introduction of the instrument by some brethren who were more liberally minded and less inclined to follow just what the Bible teaches. He added, if the worldly unauthorized customs and practices that are popular with innovationists and sectarians are forced into the church over the protest of godly men, division is not only imminent, but it may become a necessity and a virtue. David Lipscomb seemed to agree with Brother Treat. He says, we have not doubted for years that if the course of adding innovation to innovation pursued by many is persisted in, that division and separation will come. And he says, nay, it ought to come. Likewise, J.W. McGarvey, sensing that division was threatening, did not fear it as the worst of calamities. He says, we must be careful to show them that we do not and will not maintain unity with anything unscriptural, whether it shows itself within our ranks or outside of them. Truth first, union afterwards, and union only in the truth. This is our motto, McGarvey said. So the idea was, of course, unity. The Bible teaches we need to be united. And the brethren taught we need to be united, but not united when unscriptural practices were brought in. Then it would be best not to be united, because it's better to follow the truth and only the truth than it is to have unity when the truth is not being practiced. Question is, why did so many churches in the North adopt innovations? Most of the innovations were in the North, not in the South. The answer is partially explained in the fact that the Christian Standard outmaneuvered the American Christian Review at almost every turn. You remember a few weeks ago we talked about a man by the name of Isaac Errett, who was a well-known preacher, but he had liberal tendencies, and he started the Christian Standard just to try to offset the effects of the American Christian Review. And Benjamin Franklin died in 1878, and his successor, John F. Rowe, was not the man Franklin was, and thus we see that the Christian Standard was able to have influence. John Rowe was of a positive conviction that the rise of innovation would divide the church. But while opposing innovations, Rowe did not act consistently in what he believed. One of the things Rowe did in opposing Isaac Errett was to publish 10 items on which the scriptures were silent, and charged that the Standard was promoting these and therefore causing division. Included in his list of 10 items were the instrument of music, the missionary societies, etc. But the last item, Rowe accused the Standard of promoting what was called at that time lesson leaves. That's the equivalent to Bible school quarterlies, Bible class books, we call them today. He said of which the Bible was silent. Errett was shrewd enough to single out the lesson leaves and ride it mercilessly. He had, of course, very little difficulty in making Rowe's position appear ludicrous. And since Rowe had declared lesson leaves to be in the same category with instrumental music and missionary societies, the answer to lesson leaves was the answer to all. So concluded the readers of the Christian Standards. We have to be careful when we make weak arguments. If we make weak arguments, then it can destroy our main arguments. Rowe, by including Bible class material, which is perfectly authorized, it's an aid in teaching the Bible. There's nothing wrong with Bible class material. But by including that in his list, along with instrumental music, for which there is no authority, and missionary societies, for which there's no authority, which are other issues, they're not aids, they're additions, then he lost that battle, and the North then was influenced strongly against his arguments. While Rowe couldn't see his inconsistency, Brother West says it's very difficult to understand, but it was an inescapable fact. So the cause of division, as we've talked about, continue to be such things as the growing use of the instrument of music in the churches after not used much at all before the war, but after 1865 they started to be used. Then also the trend toward denominationalism, and then silence of the Scriptures. Silence of the Scriptures being an attitude by some that if the Bible was silent on these issues, then they could be used, whereas really the view should be we need authority for the things we do. Some of those who did stand against this digression, these innovations, was a preacher by the name of F.G. Allen, and he spoke strongly against these things. He said somehow in the last few years, a number of our preachers in Missouri and some other states have fallen into the habit of delivering addresses at these preachers' meetings and conventions that require a great deal of explanation. Sometimes they are months trying to get the people to understand what they meant and what they didn't mean. There is no necessity for this. What the Bible clearly teaches on any subject may be presented, so presented that the people to understand it cannot help but to understand it. So, what he's saying is the preachers who were leading the church away from the truth were preaching sermons that were very difficult to understand, whereas this New Testament gospel is very simple to understand. Some of those who were involved in this promotion of liberalism were two preachers, one by the name of J.H. Garrison and another one by the name of W.T. Moore. We've mentioned Moore previously. He was the preacher for the Central Church, the largest church in Cincinnati. Garrison was the editor of another paper called The Christian Evangelist and devoted his life to promoting liberalism, winning many to his position. Garrison believed that there were Christians in all churches. Baptism was far from being essential to church membership and was not necessary for salvation. He felt the church was another sect and proposed and supported the disciples of Christ join a federal council of Protestant churches, which, by the way, they did in 1907 after the division was official. W.T. Moore was born in 1832 in Henry County, Kentucky, just 2 counties up Interstate 71 from here. He graduated from Bethany College in 1858 as valedictorian of his class. He preached for the largest church, as I mentioned, in Cincinnati from 1866 to 1878. He then moved to England and spent 18 years there preaching and writing. When he moved to England, he ignored the small congregation of disciples that met there. Rather than that, he rented Cambridge Hall and selected 50 persons for a choir, none of whom were members of the church. And he proposed to set forth undenominational Christianity. Now think about that. Your choir is none of them members of the church, yet you want to have undenominational Christianity. He began publishing a paper in 1881 in which he advocated the church accept into membership all members of denominations who had been sprinkled for baptism, but that the church itself would only practice immersion. Not sure how he came to that conclusion. Doesn't make sense to me, but that was what he taught. The influence of these two men was significant, even with much opposition, which was led by David Lipscomb, F.G. Allen, I just had a quote from him, and F.D. Srigley. Srigley was the front page editor for the Gospel Advocate from 1890 to 1940, 50 years. He worked with Lipscomb. Well, Lipscomb died in 1917, but he worked with him for many years. William Cobb, in The Christian Leader, wrote in 1890, "Whenever men abandon the Bible as a standard of truth and exalt their conceptions of the truth to the dignity of a tribunal at whose bar the Bible itself is to be tried, there is not much uncertainty in respect to results." Indicative of the trend in the brotherhood toward adopting things that weren't scriptural was the revival of the controversy over the pious unimmersed, that is, people who were religious but had not been baptized for the remission of their sins. I mentioned that a few weeks ago has been one of the trends, and it was a problem from the earliest days, actually, of the Restoration movement. The question had constantly been asked, what shall become of the pious members of the denominations who die without being immersed? Preachers had proclaimed that the Bible taught baptism, immersion, to be necessary to salvation. But does this imply the unimmersed will be lost? Those who frankly faced this implication were considered uncharitable and legalistic. If they said they would be lost, then they were uncharitable. Those who managed to squeeze in room in heaven for the unbaptized somehow considered they had caught more of the true spirit of restoration and breathed a more spiritual atmosphere. The whole question of where the pious and immersed stood with regard to their own salvation and the fellowship of members of the church displayed two attitudes. The Christian Evangelist, a paper that I've mentioned, on the one hand advocated the liberal spirit, displaying no reticence to shut its eyes on immersion when it deemed it wise, declaring at the same time that the Church of Christ believes that it is wiser to keep the spirit of a commandment than the letter. That's It's wiser to keep the Spirit rather than keeping the commandment itself. Of course, just how an individual kept the spirit of a commandment without doing what the commandment enjoined, the Christian evangelist never proposed to explain. How do you do that? How do you keep the spirit of a commandment but don't keep the commandment itself? That makes no sense. The other attitude was one as expressed by F.D. Srigley. As I've just mentioned, was the editor, the front page editor of the Gospel Advocate for 50 years. He said of the pious unimmersed question, as I understand the New Testament, the pious unimmersed ought to be immersed. And in case they're not immersed, I know of no promise in the New Testament that they will be saved. But as to whether God will make allowance for honest mistakes and save those who think they are obeying him when in reality they're doing something he has not commanded in lieu of what he has commanded, is a question for God to settle. I decline to take any part in it. So he said if they're pious, religious, and they haven't been immersed, then they need to be immersed. And he didn't know of any exceptions of that, but of course he was not the final judge, and he made that clear. God would make the final, Christ and God will make the final judgment as to where people spend eternity. And of course we know that to be true. Thus, the germane to the spirit of liberalism arising in the brotherhood was the basic conception of the church. To Garrison, that I've mentioned, there were Christians in all churches, and the purpose of the restoration was to unite all these Christians. Baptism, far from being essential to church membership, could be cast aside, thus opening the doors of heaven to pious regardless of their immersion or lack of it. The church, in the final analysis, was another sect and thus a denomination at best. Before finishing tonight, I want to spend a few minutes talking about another man that had a lot of influence and a part of the history of the church, particularly from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, a man by the name of Daniel Sommer. He was quite harsh in his preaching some of the time, and he was particularly adept at making close friends, but because of his harsh preaching, he made fierce enemies. Only he preferred to call them friendly friends and unfriendly friends, never enemies. He found a martyr's satisfaction in thinking of himself as the most hated and most loved man in the disciple brotherhood. Well, I can see being satisfied that you would be called the most loved man, but being the most hated, I'm not too sure about that. I don't think I would want that tag on my name, but anyway, as I said, he was influential, although reared in almost absolute poverty. By sheer determination, he became the protege of Elder Ben Franklin, that we've talked about at length, and one of the most popular preachers in the brotherhood. Some people like harsh teaching. Others don't. It can hardly be denied that he was spiritually a giant, and physically he was a giant. He was born in 1850 in Maryland, and he lived 90 years and died in 1940. So he lived through the time period we're talking about and beyond. His father, he didn't know his father because he died when Daniel was a young man, and his father was only 41 years old. And Sommer was only a child at the time, and of course then didn't remember his father very well. When he died, he left his widow, that is Daniel's father, left his widow with no money and a large family. The future for the family looked dark from a financial standpoint. Sommer learned that tribulation is a difficult but necessary school in which to learn patience and perseverance. In the spring of 1859, Daniel was hired out to do his first work. He was only 9 years old. and the law said a boy could not do public work under the age of 10. But his employer was a friend and conveniently lied about his age. And the friend, or his employer, the job he took, was building roads through that section of Maryland. And he hired Daniel for a very small salary to help in the construction. Young Daniel arose before daylight every morning, put his breakfast and lunch in a sack, and walked several miles to be at the place of work on time. He would walk back again at night and fall exhausted upon the floor of the log cabin, only to have the process repeated the next day. 9 years old. He learned poverty and hard work at a very young age. His parents nominally were Lutherans, and at the age of 16, during the winter of 1866, he took an easier job. He chopped wood for a living. Think about that. That's with an axe. It was during this time that he heard of a group of people called the Disciples of Christ. He heard it rumored that these people had no knowledge of heartfelt religion and had no experience in conversion. They simply took the attitude he heard that if they did certain things, God was obligated to save them. The whole affair was rumored to be a cold, legalistic type of religion, and of course, was condemned. Hopefully that they didn't actually do that, but at least that was the reputation they had, and that was unfortunate. When Sumner went to work for a man by the name of John Dallas Everett, a member of the church, he was now placed directly in line for some wholesome teaching. Finally, in August 1869, he would have been 19, he was baptized in Middletown, Pennsylvania. After his baptism, he began to think about being a gospel preacher. But to be a gospel preacher, he felt he needed more education, had very little education, as we described. 9 years old, he worked daylight to dark, so he didn't have time to be educated. So he went to Bethany College. It was the closest of the schools, and it was connected with the Brotherhood, so that's where he went. He came to Bethany in the same state of poverty that had characterized his entire life. Consequently, he worked hard to pay his way while going to school and went greatly in debt besides. Knew nothing but hard times. But while he was there at Bethany, there was a group, a Ladies' Mite Society, that's M-I-T-E, Mite Society, was organized, and the announcement made that the hat would be passed that each person might give his mite to this work. The Mite Society held frequent meetings, which in Sumner's opinion degenerated into something very worldly. It was the custom of the church to invite different preachers among the students to speak at the Sunday evening services at the church. When Sumner received his invitation, he chose the first psalm as a text and closed his discourse with a severe blast at the Mite Society. What'd I say? Harsh preacher. The blow staggered the society, and in a matter of few days, it died peacefully. But the blast shook Sumner's popularity considerably around the school. He was not popular as a result of his preaching, what he had done, but that was the man he was, the kind of preaching he did. He saw something that was wrong, he thought was wrong, he dealt with it often in a harsh way. Should maybe have been more gentle, but that's what he did. The American Christian Review, in the meantime, after Franklin had died, had been sold, and Sumner saw an opportunity to take advantage to purchase the paper from this man, and he changed the name for some reason to the Octographic Review. Gradually, Sumner became more and more in demand as a preacher in the state of Indiana, a fact which made Indianapolis seem more than ever like the best location from which to publish the review. Early in 1894, Sumner moved to that city, and the first issue of this Octographic Review came from Indianapolis on March 20th, 1894. When Sumner moved to Indianapolis, he joined a congregation there that had about 20 members. and he spent the rest of his life, 46 years in Indianapolis, and he identified himself with this church in North Indianapolis and preached there on and off for that congregation until he died. Sumner went to extremes at times. Even he himself admitted that. For a short while, he held the view that preaching had no place in the morning worship. Think about that. He soon saw that was an extreme, and he abandoned that course. When he was taught or learned, he changed, fortunately. He opposed religious papers, accepting secular advertising, not papers, but he thought they should not accept any secular advertising. He charged that Bible schools were started to glorify men. It is true that some schools were named after men, but they weren't started necessarily named after men. For instance, Lipscomb University started as the Nashville Bible School when David Lipscomb was alive, and he never intended to have a school named after him. After he died, then it was renamed David Lipscomb College, then David Lipscomb University, and now today we know it as Lipscomb University, but he didn't start it for that reason. And then he also took the view, charged that money given to Bible schools took away money that could be given to the church. And that's something that view that he held is maybe true, because back in the 1980s, I remember Harry Pickup Jr., who was a fundraiser for Florida College, said that his biggest problem in raising money, he'd go to brethren to raise money for the college, and they would say, well, any money I have, I give to the church. And he didn't have money to give to the college. So later he said he was not opposed to Bible schools, but against the church establishing schools. And of course, I would agree with that. Bible schools are fine. Schools in which the Bible is taught are fine and secular, but the church has no business starting Bible schools nor contributing to those schools. That's a separate organization. There's no authority for churches to do that. So Sumner had his good points and his bad points, but he did have a big influence on part of the country during this time. So we will stop there tonight. We have one more week, and there's a lot of material to cover. I will be summarizing most of the remaining material, and we're talking about some of the things in more detail, but next Tuesday night will be the end of this study. We thankful that you joined us tonight, and remember, tomorrow night we have a similar class, not on church history, but on 1 Samuel at 7:30. Mark will be teaching that, and then David Norfleet will be teaching on names of God Thursday night at 7:30. And remember, we invite you to come to be with us on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. or 11 a.m. We have services at both times, and invite you to come and be a part of that if you have the opportunity to do so. So we're going to end tonight with a word of prayer, and I want to focus mainly tonight on the coronavirus. Father, we're thankful unto you for all the blessings you've given to us, and the many things you've done for us. And tonight we want to remember those who have been affected by the coronavirus, not only in our community, but in our state, our country, and in the world itself. Just this day we've learned, or in the last few days, about a gospel preacher who is now on a ventilator, an elder who has now just entered the hospital, and others who have contracted this virus. We're thankful that some have improved. Some of our members who've had the virus are better. We're thankful for that. We're thankful we've not lost any members as a result of this virus. And we're so thankful for this vaccine, which was available yesterday and is now being given to people. And we pray that the virus will soon be under control and we can be back to be able to serve you and be able to have our worship periods and do those things that you would have us to do. Bless us as we serve you. Always help us to want to do your will. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.